Good afternoon, friends. I welcome you all to this today's EduSat lecture. We have today with the very eminent Professor Dr. Ashok Sareen, who is a professor of economics and teaching in Delhi University since last 40 years. Professor Sareen has edited one book and has several research papers published in various journals. Professor Sareen is specialized in monetary economics, and today's talk he is going to give about fiscal policy and economic stability. My request to all of you is that first you listen his lecture for nearly 35 to 40 minutes, and then you will have nearly 20 minutes to ask the questions and get the response. I request all the media centers and all other who they are watching this program to kindly interact and ask questions as much as you can, so that you should get the benefit, and that is what is the use of this live lecture. Now I'll request Professor Sareen to address you on the today's topic. Professor Sareen, please.
Thank you very much. As you know, today's topic is fiscal policy and economic stability. We have to first understand what is fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is one of the important macroeconomic policies available with the government to regulate the economy. The other policy which is available with the government to regulate the economy is the monetary policy. Now we should understand what are the basic elements of fiscal policy and what do we mean by economic stability. First, the basic elements of fiscal policy. There are two elements of fiscal policy, that is the expenditure policy of the government and the tax policy of the government. In fact, these two policies are contained in the budget of any central government, so this is also termed as budgetary policy. What do we understand by the term fiscal, what do we understand by the term economic stability? Economic stability can be explained in terms of the stability in the macroeconomic variables like GDP, general price level, etc., and the stability of economic system of an economy. Let us explain in detail the stability of macroeconomic variables or instability in the macroeconomic variables. Before I explain the meaning of instability, we must understand what do we mean by a stable situation. A stable situation is a steady state situation where in macroeconomics we call macroeconomic is in equilibrium when desired aggregate expenditure in the economy is equal to actual level of output. And actual level of output, in fact, the desired level of expenditure should be equal to the potential level of output. What is potential level of output? Potential level of output is that level of output which an economy can produce when all its resources are fully utilized with the given technology. are in a growing economy when an economy attains that rate of growth which it can maximum attain with the resources at its disposal and with the given technology. The desired expenditure has various components in an economy. For example, in an open economy, the desired expenditure has basically 4 components. These are private consumption or consumption of the household, private investment, government expenditure, and annex, that is net export. Net export can be defined as export minus import. Now, what causes instability? When the desired level of expenditure or when actual level of Y is not equal to its potential level, let us define the potential level as Y star. So, when economy's potential level of income is either greater than the actual level of income, or when the potential level of income is less than the actual level of income, then it is called an unstable situation. The task of fiscal policy is to bring the actual level of income as close to the potential level of income as possible. Now, when actual level of income, that is Y, is less than the potential level of income, it is called deflationary gap. That means the economy is not producing enough to absorb all its labor force. That means in that economy, the level of unemployment would be more than the natural level of unemployment. The natural level of unemployment is the level of unemployment where all possible able-bodied persons are fully employed. But in any economy, we understand that it is not a possible situation. It has certain level of unemployment which is either because of friction, which is called frictional unemployment, seasonal unemployment, or technological unemployment. So these unemployments are there in every economy. So when the potential level of income is greater than the actual level of income, then it has a situation of the actual level of unemployment is greater than the potential level of unemployment, which we call, once again I repeat, which we call deflationary gap. And when actual level of output is greater than the potential level of output, it leads to inflation, or we call it inflationary gap. So basically speaking, any deviation from Y would cause instability in the economy, either in terms of higher level of unemployment or in terms of higher rate of inflation. Now, what do we understand by the term economic instability? That is the instability in the economic system. That means in a capitalist economy, there are problems, there are crises because of the market failure, and there are situations in the history where the capitalism has faced difficulties, problems, crises. So fiscal policy is an important tool available with the government to correct all those difficulties or imbalances in the economy, so that the economy goes back to its track. Now, we understand, then now we will have to understand how instability in the economy can be corrected by adopting a right type of fiscal policies. We know that the basic reason for instability is deviation of Y from Y star, that is deviation of actual level of income from the potential level of income. Now, fiscal policy has an important element, that is the government expenditure. Now, when we analyze the aggregate demand or desired expenditure in the economy, as I explained to you earlier, it has 4 components: consumption, investment, government expenditure and NX. So, the government expenditure occupies an important part, an important place in the total expenditure of the economy. That is, by variation in G, the aggregate expenditure in the economy can be varied. For example, if in any economy the desired level of expenditure is less than the actual level of output, then the G can be increased. And if it is more than that, the G can be reduced. Similarly, the tax policy, which is an important element of fiscal policy, by changing the tax rate, the disposable income of the household can be changed. That is, by increasing the tax rate, disposable income of the household can be reduced, and by reducing the tax rate, it can be increased. And the disposable income is a very important factor which determines aggregate consumption of the household. So, we can say that by the variation in tax rate, that is by changing the tax policy, by the variation in government expenditure, that is by changing the G, the aggregate expenditure in the economy can be changed and it can be brought in equilibrium with the actual level of output. Now, as I explained to you earlier, that these 2 elements of fiscal policy, that is the expenditure policy and the tax policy, are contained in the budgetary statement of the government. We can explain the various aspects of government budget. Government budget can be termed as deficit, surplus and balanced budget. Let us define BS as balanced budget, which is equal to TR minus G. TR is government revenue from tax collection. Let us assume that TR is a linear function of Y. That is, as Y increases, the total tax revenue of the government increases by T%. That is, if the tax rate in the economy, let us assume it has a fixed tax rate and the tax rate is 20%. If the economy goes up by 1%, then the tax revenue of the government will increase by 0.2% of the GDP. Now, if tax revenue is greater than government expenditure, we call the budget surplus is positive. That is, or we can say that the fiscal deficit or the budget deficit is falling. When TR is less than government expenditure, that is total revenue of the government through taxes is less than government expenditure, budget surplus is negative or budget is in deficit. If TR is equal to G, it is called a balanced budget. Now, here it would be important to understand the various concepts of budget, that is cyclical and structural budget surplus or deficit, fiscal and primary deficit. When budget deficit increases, we call the fiscal policy is expansionary. On the other hand, when budget deficit falls or turns surplus, it is called contractionary fiscal policy. But this may not be the right way to describe the fiscal policy, because if we look at the equation of budget surplus, we find that there are three variables which affect budget surplus, that is tax rate, GDP, that is Y, and government expenditure. We find that the budget surplus can be influenced by the change in Y without there being any change in tax rate or government expenditure. That is, during boom, when Y increases and if T remains the same and G also remains the same, then the budget surplus of the country, of the economy will go up or the budget deficit will go down. Similarly, during depression, when Y falls, T remaining the same, the total revenue of the government will fall and the budget surplus will fall or the budget deficit will increase. That does not mean that the fiscal policy stance of the government has changed. The fiscal policy stance of the government will be, we will call it has changed when only either the tax rate changes or the government expenditure changes. So, if we stick to the definition of budget surplus, which is TR minus G, and we see that the TR is a function of small t and Y, and if budget surplus changes with the change in only Y, it is because of cyclical factors. It is not a structural change. The structural change would be either when the T changes or when the G changes. So, it would be pertinent to understand how do we calculate the budget structural budget surplus. Structural budget surplus can be calculated as, the structural budget balance can be estimated as follows, that is BS star minus BS is equal to T Y star minus Y. That is, BS star is the full employment or potential level of BS at the potential level of GDP. This is cyclically adjusted surplus or deficit. The structural budget balance is an estimate of budget balance excluding the cyclical factors. It is the structural budget balance that signals the change in fiscal policy. Increase in structural budget signals an expansionary fiscal policy, and decrease in the budgetary in structural budget signals contractionary fiscal policy. The cyclical balance reflects the influence of the business cycle on government revenue and expenditure for an unchanged structural balance in the current period. All federal budgets have a built-in structure that increases the tax revenue intake during booms and reduces it during recession. The structural budget balance is an estimate of the budget balance excluding the cyclical factors. The federal budget balance therefore moves automatically with the business cycle towards a surplus during a boom and towards a deficit during recession, as I explained to you earlier. Estimates of structural budget balance attempts to wash out these cyclical factors to identify any discretionary change that the government has made to existing spending and taxation setting. The importance of this concept is that it reveals how government changed the budget setting to achieve longer term macroeconomic policy objectives. For example, faced with the global financial crisis, G20 government all agreed to engage in coordinated fiscal stimulus. In other words, they all agreed to change the setting of the structural budget balances towards deficit and away from surplus. So, it should be clear to the students the difference between cyclical budget deficit and structural budget deficit. It is the change in structural budget deficit which signals the change in policy stance. Now, we shall explain another very important concept regarding budget, that is primary deficit and deficit on revenue account. Primary deficit is one of the parts of fiscal policy, while fiscal deficit is the difference between total revenue and expenditure. Primary deficit can be arrived by deducting interest payment of the government from fiscal deficit. Government borrows money from the public and it has to pay interest on its borrowing. So, the interest payment is deducted from fiscal deficit to arrive at the primary deficit. Now, it is important to know that the debt GDP ratio is impacted by primary deficit. An increase in primary deficit implies debt burden of the government is rising. This requires a bit of explanation. Supposing in an economy the debt GDP ratio is say 100%, and in that economy the nominal interest rate on government borrowing is say 10%. So, without any addition of burden, of debt burden, without taking any additional debt, the net burden of the debt will increase by 10% because of the payment of interest on the previous debt. So, if the debt GDP ratio is to be reduced, it is important that the primary deficit should be surplus, that is, it should be positive. It is only then the debt GDP ratio will come down, meaning thereby if the nominal growth rate of GDP in an economy is 10% and the nominal interest rate on government debt is also 10%, then the debt GDP ratio will remain the same if there is no additional debt taken by the government. If this debt GDP ratio is to be reduced, then the growth rate, that is G, has to be greater than the interest rate, and the debt GDP ratio will fall by the difference between G, that is the growth rate in nominal GDP, minus R, that is the rate of interest on government borrowing. Now, this concept of debt GDP ratio is very important because we notice that in many of the countries of Eurozone, they have a very high debt GDP ratio, and they are facing acute economic crisis. On this we will come back again when we discuss the various criticisms of active fiscal policy, but sufficient here to say that higher debt GDP ratio is not a good indication for any economy, because it has the potential of many crises, that is even the crisis of default on the part of government if the debt it owns is not in its own currency but in the foreign currency. This point we shall take up later on. Now, let us now explain another concept, which is the government's expenditure, because the total expenditure of the government, the items on which government spends, can be classified into two, that is expenditure on the capital account and expenditure on the revenue account. Now, what are the expenditures on the capital account? When government spends money on the construction of road, that is when with the expenditure of the government any assets is created, it is termed as capital expenditure, because this will add to the productive capacity of the economy. That means when government spends its money on the construction of roads, on building schools, colleges, hospitals, and improving other economic infrastructure, all this expenditure is under capital account. And on revenue account, the maintenance of these assets which are created with the help of expenditure on the capital account will come under revenue account. So, that means maintenance, salary, subsidies and interest payment of the government, they are the part of revenue expenditure on the revenue account. Now, we understand that the expenditure on the revenue account normally do not generate any income to the government. But if government is spending on these items, that is on subsidies, salaries and the maintenance of government buildings by borrowing, that means government is not earning any income on this expenditure, but on the other hand it is paying interest on the expenditure incurred on these items. So, this can have potentially very disastrous consequences for any government, because it will lead to increase in debt GDP ratio. On the other hand, expenditure on the capital account may not yield sufficient return or return equal to the interest rate which government pays on borrowing the debt. Here again we will see that in the short period it will add to the debt GDP ratio, but there is an argument which says that that does not mean that government should stop spending on items in the capital account which is not generating enough revenue, or should cut down its expenditure on the revenue account, that is on subsidies, salaries, etc. Because some of these expenditures may not yield immediate returns to the government, but they give much larger social returns than the economic return. So, the social return from expenditures on these items could be far more than the economic returns, and the long term economic return could be much higher than the short term return. for example, if government spends a huge amount of money in creating economic infrastructure which has a very long gestation period, the payback period for this investment could be very large. So, the return per annum could be very small, but it will have externalities to other sectors. That means, it can help in creating higher income in those sectors which will make use of this economic infrastructure created by the government. So, additional infrastructure or additional productive capacity or additional economic infrastructure created by the government by spending money or even borrowing will not be a bad idea if it leads to higher economic growth, because as we know, higher economic growth will generate more tax revenue to the government, and at some stage the government will recover the expenditure done on these items, because the government is not there in the business to make money. Government is there to see that the social return is generated and the long term interest of the economy is protected. Now, we shall now see that how a government can finance its deficit. That means, what are the sources of its finance, that is from where government can borrow money to bridge this gap between its revenue and expenditure. There are two sources. One is the borrowing from the public, that is again it will increase public debt, and borrowing from the central bank, that is the monetization of government debt. It is generally argued that borrowing from central bank would lead to increase in money supply, and if the economy is at full employment or at its potential level, it will lead to increase in prices or inflation. Even if the economy is not at its potential level, like in India, we see that we are far below our potential level, but in our economy at the present, the problem is that there are various supply bottlenecks. In the presence of these supply bottlenecks, if more expenditure is incurred by borrowing from central bank, that is by increasing the money supply, it can be inflationary, it can further add to the inflationary pressure in the economy. Now, we shall now come to the desirability of having an active fiscal policy in the economy. There are two viewpoints. One viewpoint is that of Keynes and another is of monetarists and new classicals. Keynes was the first economist who brought about a kind of revolution in economic thinking. In 1930s, when the world was reeling under Great Depression, Keynes advocated for active fiscal policy. According to him, if equilibrium in the national income is to be maintained, or if the economy is to be brought back to its track, it is important that government should increase the expenditure. When government increases the expenditure, it will have a multiple impact, as I told you earlier, on Y and employment. But on the other hand, and his basic premise was that we cannot rely on market forces to bring back the equilibrium. His basic premise was that markets are inherently unstable, and if we rely on markets for equilibrium, or if government does not intervene in the market, then we will have this bouts of boom and recession and depression quite regularly in the economy. In order to mitigate or in order to moderate this fluctuation, it is very essential that the government pursues a active fiscal policy. According to him, the prices are not as flexible as was argued by the classical economist. Classical economists believed that markets are efficient, prices are flexible, any disequilibrium in the market, that is, if there is a high rate of unemployment in the economy, the wages will fall and the demand for labor will increase and the economy will come back to the full employment level or at its potential level of output. Keynes contested this argument and he said, no, prices are not flexible, rather the prices are sticky. If you rely on the markets for its correction, then this procedure will be very long and painful. To avoid this lengthy, painful procedure of correction by the market, it is important that the governments follow active fiscal policy. But on the other hand, there is another school of thought which is led by monetarists and now by new classicals. In fact, the new classicals are of the view that government is absolutely redundant as far as economic functions are concerned. According to them, government is a very inefficient institution. So, the role of government in running the economy should be minimized. An active fiscal policy means the size of the government budget will increase and government will occupy a very important economic space in the economy, which according to them will bring more instability rather than stability. Another school of thought which is led by Milton Friedman, which we call the monetary school of thought, they also believe that it is not important to have an active fiscal policy, but they supported that the monetary policy could be more effective in bringing equilibrium in the economy than the fiscal policy. Now, let us in brief discuss the basic arguments advanced by what we call fiscal hawkish or fiscal hawks are by monetarists and new classical economists. The first argument is that active government fiscal policy or increase in fiscal deficit crowds out private investment. What does it mean? It basically means that when government increases its expenditure and it finances its expenditure through borrowing from the public, then it will lead to increase in interest rate. Why? Because the supply of government paper, which we call, will increase, which will reduce the price of government bonds and will increase the interest rate. If interest rate goes up, the private investment will go down. So, they argue that government expenditure, that is the increase in government expenditure, will crowd out the private investment. The second argument is also related with this. When interest rate goes up, the investment level in the economy goes down, then the composition of GDP changes. That means now in the GDP, the percentage share of investment goods will fall and the percentage share of consumption goods will increase, because if government concentrates its expenditure in purchase of consumer goods or in making transfer payments. Now we will counter, I mean this both these points have been contested by Keynesians, that we will take up one by one later on. Let us first see what are the other objections of classicals and monetarists in pursuing active fiscal policy. Another argument is that the higher fiscal deficit leads to current account deficit. The basic argument here is this, that when government expenditure increases and government expenditure is financed by borrowing, then the domestic saving has to be greater than domestic investment. That means government can borrow from if the government borrows from domestic sources, then it is important that the domestic saving has to be greater than domestic investment. If the domestic saving is not greater than domestic investment, or if it is equal to domestic investment, then the only way the government expenditure can be financed is through borrowing from the outside the country, that is the foreign borrowing. When foreign borrowing is done, we know that the balance of payment is always balanced. So there are two parts of balance of payment. One is the capital account and the current account. If the borrowing is done from outside the country, then the capital account has to be surplus. If the capital account is in surplus, then the current account has to be deficit. The current account deficit can be attained when imports are greater than export. So that means the balance of trade in the economy has to be in deficit. That is why it is called that fiscal deficit and current account deficit, they go hand in hand. They are the two sides of the same coin, because somebody has to provide the money for government expenditure. Either it is households, or if household saving is not enough to even meet the domestic investment, or if it is just enough to meet the domestic investment, then the borrowing has to be done from outside the country. Therefore, it is said that the current fiscal deficit will lead to current account deficit also. Now, there is another, we will again counter this point later on when we take it up. There is another point which is generally made by classicals, is that the increase in government debt due to expansionary fiscal policy may get counterbalanced by the reduction in private consumption. This argument is based on the concept of Ricardian equivalence. As you know that Ricardo was a famous economist, a famous classical economist. He coined this, he in fact propounded this hypothesis. We will explain this, And this hypothesis, I suppose,
yeah, we can finish in 1-2 minutes so that we have the time for the questions actually.
okay. So let me finish this. What is Ricardian Ricardian hypothesis first? You know, the Ricardian equivalence. The Ricardian equivalence is that the basic idea behind Ricardo theory is that no matter how a government chooses to increase spending, whether the debt financing or debt financing or tax financing, the outcome will be the same and demand will remain unchanged. That means government spending will not lead to change in aggregate demand. According to this doctrine, what determines consumption is the lifetime present value of after-tax income, and hence that say a temporary tax cut won't stimulate spending because people will figure.
Just a minute. We have got a question from somewhere from Uttar Pradesh.
Yeah.
So just can you just please go ahead.
Sir, what is the GDP?
What is GDP?
Oh, GDP is the gross domestic product, which is another name, another way of saying national income. I'm sorry, I thought that people have this, students have this elementary knowledge of GDP. That's why I didn't explain this term, GDP.
No, there may be another question which may relate to that you were talking lots of borrowing and all that kind of thing. One doesn't know really, we have got lots of these kind of jargons like inflation in the economy. But in real terms, for a layman or for a person who doesn't know what is really inflation, and especially the index which is being talked various times that this is because of this region inflation is this is because of this region inflation is this. Can you just explain in short terms that what is really inflation means?
Inflation in fact means a continuous rise in price level. Inflation is in fact it is a rate of change in price level. So one very contradictory statement that we come across is then when we see on the television or in the newspaper the headline that the inflation has come down.
Yes.
And in real terms, when you go to the market and you feel that, you find that the prices of every commodities have gone up.
Yes.
So how to reconcile these two statements?
Right.
When we say that the inflation has come down,
right,
we mean that the rate of increase in price level has come down.
Okay.
That means earlier if the prices were rising by 10%, now they are rising by less than 10%. So they are rising, in fact, nonetheless, prices are rising, but the rate of rise in price has fallen.
Okay.
That is why it is said that the inflation has come down, but that does not mean the prices have come down. The prices may continue to go up, but the inflation still may go down.
Then I have got another question, which is very interesting, is that yesterday I was talking to my daughter and she said that tell me one thing, that suppose if the government want to put some money into the circulation, can government put any kind of money, means if they can put print as many as currencies as they want, or they cannot?
No, they cannot, because in fact this is the RBI or the central bank of every government which has the right to print money.
Right.
And there is a procedure to print the money.
Okay.
You know, the money is the liability of the central bank. When the money supply goes up, the liability of the central bank goes up.
Yeah.
It has to have the corresponding amount of assets also.
Okay. Now we have got question from Pumba. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I want to know something about fiscal budgeting. What is fiscal budgeting?
Fiscal
budgeting.
Fiscal budgeting. Physical budgeting.
Not, it is not the physical budget, it is the fiscal.
He is talking fiscal. Yeah.
Fiscal budget. I mean, fiscal policy and the budgetary policy, they are in fact synonymous, because as I explained to you, the fiscal policy has two elements, that is the expenditure policy and the tax policy of the government, and these two statements are contained in the budget of every government. So when we talk about the budget policy or budget of the government, we are talking about the fiscal policy of the government.
Okay. Any other question we have? Okay. Now I just wanted to ask you one. In your lecture, you were talking about microeconomics, and then you were talking coordinated physical balance, and you mentioned about it that this is being done by the governments when there is a problem in the economy in the whole world. Am I right?
Yeah, what I was saying was this, that during after 2008 meltdown, that is
Right.
financial crisis,
Right.
many developed countries went into deep recession.
Okay.
There was a need to the problem there was that there was not enough aggregate demand in each of these countries.
Okay.
So it was decided that if the developed world is to be brought out of this mess, it is very important that there has to be a coordinated efforts by all the concerned governments to increase the expenditure. Because we find that in 1930s, when the world, the developed world went into depression, they did not have the coordination, and they in fact followed the competitive policies. That means every government went on the policy of pursuing the devaluation of its currency.
Okay.
So this is known as beggar thy neighbor policy.
Okay.
So in order to avoid that, it was felt that this huge problem of recession can be tackled only if there is a coordination, or there is a coordinated effort on the part of the governments to bring the economies back to the track.
Now there is another question which is related to this, that you tell me one thing, that lots of time we have got the discussion amongst the economists and others also, that if American economy is in rise, then the whole world will get rise in economy. How this is, whether this is misnomer or this has got some very substantial evidence?
It is no misnomer, because the general saying is this, that if America gets cold, the rest of the world gets pneumonia. So the reason is because America is such a big economy. It is a 40 trillion economy, and the second largest economy, that is China, is just $5 to $6 trillion. So there is a huge gap.
Okay.
So America has a huge trade, both in terms of imports and exports. So when American economy is in depression, its imports fall. Its import is the exports of other countries. So when we see that when in 2008, after Lehman Brothers fall, when the American economy went into deep recession, then it has the cascading effect on other economies also, largely those economies which were exporting to America, Germany and China. So that is why, because in today's world, economies are linked with each other. We are living in a global world. So what is happening in one corner of the world has an impact on others. For example, America is a very big country, and we find that even in Cyprus, something small, Cyprus is just a small economy, and because of the financial crisis there, it had its impact on the financial markets of the world.
Okay.
So this linkage, this is called the coupling of the developed world or America with the rest of the world, has become stronger year after year.
Now you were talking about the Ricardian equivalence, in which I just stopped you. So if you can finish in 1-2 minutes, then if we have got the question, we will ask that.
Yeah, basically the Ricardian equivalence is, Ricardo's basic argument was that if government increases its expenditure, which is funded by borrowing, and if the debt GDP ratio goes up, then public realize that this debt GDP ratio is not sustainable.
Okay.
So sooner or later, government will resort to increasing the tax rate. So there will be heavy burden of taxes on them. So when government increases income, increases expenditure, or cuts its taxes to stimulate demand in the economy, they do not increase their present consumption. They in fact save in order to pay for higher taxes in future
Okay.
when the government will increase the taxes. So this is a basic hypothesis of Ricardo. That means one does not spend on the basis of its current income, but one's consumption is based on its lifetime income.
Okay.
So you try to maximize your total utility through consumption by looking at the total lifetime income that you will earn.
Okay.
This is the basic theory, the Ricardian equivalence. Tomorrow we shall dwell on this in detail and see the various criticisms that are there.
Okay.
If there is any question, we...
No, but I remember one thing you were doing, that you were when you during delivering your lecture, you were mentioning so many topics that we will be dealing it later. Later means you are going to talk tomorrow?
Tomorrow, yes.
Tomorrow when you will have the lecture, then you are going to clarify all that.
Yeah, various, so I will first... I will first tell you what things we have covered today and what are the things that we left for tomorrow. Yeah. So
my request to you that if you can just throw some salient point that what you are going to talk tomorrow, so that will people will be prepared and then can ask certain questions.
Basically the various criticism of active fiscal policy and their counter arguments given by Keynesians.
Okay,
so the Keynesians have countered all the arguments against fiscal policy given by classicals and monetarists. Keynesians firmly believe that if the economy is in depression, then the active fiscal policy, that means a big stimuli, a big stimulation, fiscal stimulation on the part of government is absolutely essential if the government is, if government wants the economy back onto the rails.
Okay, now that is one. The second is that in today's context, we had the budget with us, and in this budget, what kind of constraints you see that how the growth will be, and what kind of the other positive indicators are, what are the negative indicators?
You mean the budget of the Indian government?
Yes.
Yeah, Indian government budget, you see the situation in India is slightly tricky in the sense that it is not only the size of the deficit, it is the quality of the deficit that is also important. It is not the how much government is spending, but it is where the government is spending. Is the government spending where it is going to add to economic capacity of the economy? Is it spending where the social return is going to be higher, or is it resorting to certain populist measures? That means the debate is whether the government spending will improve their what you call productive capacity. Okay, whether it is it will empower them, or it is just an increase in their entitlement. So this is the debate between empowerment and entitlement.
Okay.
Of course, in an Indian economy where there is a lot of poverty, some amount of entitlement is also necessary, but there has to be a right mix on the government expenditure between empowerment and entitlement.
Okay, so with this, I think we are coming close to today's lecture, and I thank all those who were able to ask questions, and I would also like to suggest that tomorrow, please be prepared to ask questions in advance so that we are able to utilize the potential of Professor Sareen on these issues, and you can also gain some knowledge on these areas. With this, I thank Professor Sareen for giving such a informative and very nice lecture, and thank you all for asking questions, and tomorrow we'll meet you all at the same time, at the same venue, with the different lecture having talks on economics issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.